Hello, Isaac here. Welcome back to my channel. Now, for those that don't know, I create, occasionally at least, videos on history, culture, and theology. But we are on a bit of a roll here, so hopefully I can keep going with these City of God videos. For the few individuals that watch, if you are watching, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. So, we've arrived at book 3 of the City of God. And in chapter 1, Augustine will establish the purpose or nature of this book. He states that he will turn from the theme of the moral bankruptcy of Roman religion, as in book 2, to the consideration of such evils as war, massacre, and famines. And Augustine will argue that true evil lies not in external misfortunes, but in moral and spiritual degradation. This contrasts with a Roman pagan perspective that only physical sufferings are to be considered evil. He writes, "It grieves them more to own a bad house than a bad life, as if it were man's greatest good to have everything good but himself." And so Augustine highlights the irony in valuing material well-being over moral integrity. Nonetheless, what Augustine will show is that pagan gods did not protect their worshippers from disasters, despite their devout worship before the coming of Christ. The world was plagued by numerous and unimaginable calamities under the watch of the pagan gods. And at the outset, Augustine stresses that though he confines himself to the calamities that befell Rome and the Roman Empire, he's treating it as typical of all nations. The scope is universal, even if the method is selective. There is, however, an exemption for Augustine, the Hebrews, who are counted worthy of divine grace. So, with that, we'll begin with chapters 2 to 8, where Augustine returns to the comparison he made between Troy and Rome in book 1. Augustine, in chapters 2 to 8, returns to the theme of the beginning of book 1, the fall of Troy and the gods common to Troy and Rome. The question for Augustine is why the gods worshipped by both the Greeks and the Romans allowed the destruction of Troy, the ancestral city of the Roman people, and he searches out the inconsistencies in Roman attitudes. First then, Troy is said to have fallen because the Trojan king Laomedon did not pay Apollo and Neptune for building the city walls. According to the story, the king hired them to build the city walls of Troy, the promise of payment for their labor. After Apollo and Neptune completed the massive construction, Laomedon broke his promise and refused to pay them for their due wages. However, Augustine finds it absurd that these gods, capable of great feats and possessing foreknowledge, were duped into working for free, and then allowed Troy to be destroyed as retribution. If these stories are believed, they reflect poorly on the character of the gods worshipped. If they are not believed, then the justification for Troy's destruction based on divine retribution for perjury falls apart. But more than this, Augustine contrasts the supposed divine punishment of Troy with the prevalent perjury and moral corruption in Rome. The question is why the gods punished Troy for Laomedon's sin, but seemingly condone or even support similar or worse behavior in Rome. And it highlights the widespread perjury among Roman senators and citizens. If the gods were just in their punishment of Troy, their apparent indifference to Roman corruption is inexplicable. So, in chapter 3, Augustine will address another reason for why the gods withdrew their protection of Troy: Paris' adultery with Helen. According to the story, Paris, during his visit to Sparta, fell in love with Helen, Menelaus' wife, and they both fled to Troy. This act outraged Menelaus, and he rallied the Greek kingdoms, bound by an oath to protect Helen's marriage, to wage war against Troy to reclaim his wife, initiating the 10-year Trojan War. But in any case, the act of adultery was condemned by the gods and is a reason why they withdrew their protection of Troy. Augustine, however, points out the absurdity of the gods being offended by behavior they themselves commonly exhibited, such as adultery. In fact, the goddess Venus committed adultery with Anchises, a mortal, which resulted in the birth of Ananias, the legendary ancestor of the Romans. In Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, Ananias survived the fall of Troy and led a group of survivors in search of a new home and eventually to the Italian peninsula, where he played a crucial role in the mythical foundations of Roman culture and identity. Therefore, the foundations of Rome itself are from adultery. But besides this, in chapter 4, Augustine refers to the Roman scholar Varro from the 1st century BC, who admitted that these myths are false, but that they might be useful for society. For instance, if people think they are of divine descent, they are more likely to undertake significant endeavours with greater boldness, and thereby achieve success more readily. Nonetheless, for Augustine, this opens a broad space for falsehoods and fabrications to develop and be endorsed. But given that these myths are inconsistent in their response to human versus divine adulteries, it undermines the very credibility of the gods and the moral lessons derived from these myths. Therefore, Augustine believes that these myths, even if recognized as false, as Varro suggested, are ill-suited for promoting societal good due to their inconsistent and morally questionable teachings. Therefore, in chapters 5 and 6, Augustine will point out that this inconsistency in their relationship to the gods and their divine retribution, as it relates to the founding of Rome itself by Romulus and his brother Remus. According to the myth, these were the sons of Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, and Mars, the god of war. First then, this involved an act of rape of Silva by the god Mars, who was a priestess of Vesta, a role which required a vow of chastity. Therefore, from the outset, Rome is founded on adultery, but it didn't receive the divine retribution as in the case of Troy. Nonetheless, returning to Romulus and Remus, the story tells that disagreements arose where to build the city and who would rule it, which led to a violent confrontation during which Romulus killed Remus. The question for Augustine then is why the gods punished Troy for the adultery of Paris and not Rome for the fratricide of Romulus. As he writes, "If the sins of men so greatly incensed those divinities that they abandoned Troy to fire and sword to punish the crime of Paris, the murder of Romulus's brother ought to have incensed them more against the Romans than the cajoling of a Greek husband moved them against the Trojans. Fratricide in a newly born city should have provoked them more than adultery in a city already flourishing." Augustine suggests that if the gods were truly just, the severity of fratricide compared to adultery should have resulted in a greater punishment for Rome. This inconsistency leads Augustine to speculate that perhaps the gods abandoned Troy, not out of moral outrage, because they were defeated, seeking instead to continue their deceptions in Rome, a city that granted them abundant honours. He writes, "So far as I can see then, no evil can be ascribed to Troy which warranted the gods in abandoning it to destruction, nor any good to Rome which accounts for the gods visiting it with prosperity, unless the truth be that they fled from Troy because they were vanquished and betook themselves to Rome to practice their characteristic deceptions there." Therefore, Augustine echoes Virgil and a key phrase of his polemic, that the gods of Troy are conquered or vanquished gods, and if those vanquished gods of Troy could not protect that city from destruction, they could hardly be expected to protect Rome. In fact, Augustine points in chapter 7 to the second destruction of Troy, and it questions again the role of gods. The first, of course, is recorded in Homer's Iliad, and is thought to have happened in the 12th or 13th century BC. The second happened much later in the 1st century BC, during the combination of the Roman civil war between Marius and Sulla and the Mithridatic war with King Mithridates VI of Pontus. During this conflict, Troy, known as Ilium in Latin, was destroyed and burnt, with its inhabitants massacred by the general of the Roman army, Fimbria, in 85 BC, who aligned with Marius. In part, the destruction of such a historically and mythically significant city was a statement of power against his enemies and potential rivals. But for Augustine, there is an irony that Rome, which was supposedly founded by the survivors of Troy, would be the source of its second destruction. More than this, however, is the injustice of the gods of Troy, who the Romans worshipped, which had now apparently abandoned the city, although it remained loyal to Rome and to the victorious side in the civil war. He writes, "The gods deserted an adulterous people and abandoned Troy to the fires of the Greeks, that out of her ashes is a chaster Rome might arise. But why did they a second time abandon this same town, allied now to Rome, and not making war upon her noble daughter, preserving a most steadfast and pious fidelity to Rome's most justifiable faction? Why did they give her up to be destroyed, not by the Greek heroes, but by the basest of the Romans?" And so, part of the point here is that the gods are not reliable defenders of the city, neither of Troy when it first fell, or when it fell again by Fimbria. Augustine here makes much of the remark from Livy that the statue of Minerva survived the second attack on Troy. In other words, the presence of the gods rather than their absence has much to do with the city's fall. As such, they can hardly be reliable defenders of Rome, as had been demonstrated in its history. He asks, where then was the wisdom of entrusting Rome to the Trojan gods, who had demonstrated their weakness in the loss of Troy? Therefore, the gods of Troy failed to shield their own city twice, or even Rome from the Gauls in 390 BC, a city that barely survived by the skin of its teeth, then it's doubtful that they could be relied upon to safeguard Rome from the Visigoths much later in the 410s. Following this, Augustine will examine from Roman history the peaceful periods and whether this can be attributed to the Roman gods. So, from chapters 9 to 20, Augustine will examine from Roman history whether the peaceful periods are due to the intervention of the gods. In chapter 9, Augustine examines the belief that the peace experienced during the reign of the second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, the successor to Romulus, was due to divine intervention. According to tradition, Numa kept Rome at peace throughout this reign, and the gate of Janus was closed, which had traditionally opened during times of war. This peace is attributed to Numa's dedication to religious observance and efforts to appease the gods. While Augustine recognizes how peace is a significant blessing, if the religious practices established by Numa were effective and diligently followed, their efficiency is certainly questionable, given that they failed to secure peace for Rome in later years. After the reign of Numa, marked by 40 years of uninterrupted peace, Rome struggled to find even a single year of peace from its founding until the reign of Augustus, except a year following the end of the First Punic War, when the gate of Janus was closed. From this, in chapter 10, Augustine will criticize the relentless wars waged by the Roman Empire merely for the sake of expansion and glory. He compares this pursuit of an excessively large and troubled empire to the unnatural growth of a giant's body. In fact, Augustine suggests that a moderate size with health, that is peace, is preferable to a large size with unnatural torments, that is endless war. In this regard, Augustine refers to Roman historian Sulla in his depiction of earlier, more peaceful times focused on cultivating the mind and the body. Nonetheless, Sulla says that Rome was forced into wars to defend itself, since their wealth and success attracted envy from neighbours. But if that was the case, Rome's peace was only contingent on its neighbours' disposition, not on the favour of its gods. In fact, for Augustine, these gods, which are demons in his view, have no power to grant peace or victory in war. Instead, their impact is only confined to provoking malevolent actions and fostering this relentless drive for domination and continuous conflict. And so, in chapter 11, Augustine will discuss the tale of the weeping statue of Apollo, which was interpreted as an ominous sign during the war with the Achaeans. For some context, the Achaean War in 146 BC was the final conflict between the Achaean League, a confederation of Greek states, and the Roman Republic. This war ended with the defeat of the Achaean League and the complete subjugation of Greece to Roman rule. In the case of the weeping statue of Apollo, it was concluded by soothsayers that it signified Apollo mourning and the impending disaster for his homeland, Greece. Augustine uses this story, though, to argue that while these myths often contain falsehoods, they also reflect truths about the nature of pagan gods and their behaviors, which is that they don't have control over events that lead to peace or war. Grieving deities in epics are representative of this truth, that those gods are in fact often helpless. The higher power that thwarts these demons is the true God, who is the genuine protector of cities. And so in chapter 12, Augustine further points out the irony that the Romans endlessly expanded their pantheon of deities after the second king, Numa, even though there was peace established during his supposed religious observance. This included major gods such as Jupiter, Asclepius, Cybele, or even Cynocephalus from Egypt, or the goddess Fever. Therefore, Augustine points out the irony in Rome's religious fervor, noting that the city, protected by an overwhelming number of deities covering every conceivable domain, still suffered great calamities. In fact, they have instead offended the true God by directing to these myriad of gods the worship and rituals that should have been exclusively his. Moreover, Rome was ironically more prosperous when it worshipped fewer gods, implying that the increase in the number of deities had been fruitless. Yet they thought that more gods equaled greater protection. As is clear from Roman history, they had failed to protect it from internal strife and external calamities. In other words, it was a misdirected faith. And so from this, Augustine will turn to the more troubling aspects of Roman history, beginning with its founding. In chapter 14, Augustine discusses the morally questionable war waged by the Romans against the Albans post-Numa's peaceful reign. For some context, the Albans were inhabitants of Alba Longa, an ancient city located in the central region of Italy. According to Roman mythology, Alba Longa was founded by Ascanius, the son of Ananias. Rhea Silvia, the mother of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, were descendants of Ascanius. Therefore, Alba Longa is the mother city of Rome. However, Hostilius, the third king of Rome and the successor of Numa, went to war with Alba Longa, leading to devastating losses on both sides. It was ultimately decided that the war should be resolved by the combat of three brothers from each side, 3 Romans and 3 Albans. This resulted in a victory for Rome, but it left only one Roman survivor out of the 3 brothers. For Augustine, this whole event is tragic, especially as they had shared lineage and kinship. They were of the same extended family, as this conflict was between a parent city, Alba, and the colony, Rome. Augustine writes, "Thus Rome remained victorious, but with such a sacrifice that only one survivor returned to his home. Whose was the loss on both sides? Whose the grief but of the offspring of Aeneas, descendants of Ascanius, the progeny of Venus, the grandsons of Jupiter? For this too was a worse than civil war, in which belligerent states were mother and daughter." For Augustine, the central question revolves around the purpose of all this bloodshed, which he sees as nothing more than a quest for glory and expansion. He considers this lust for power and dominion a vice that perpetuates endless cycles of violence. As he writes, "This lust of sovereignty disturbs and consumes the human race with frightful ills. By this lust Rome was overcome when she triumphed over Alba, and praising her own crime called it glory. For, as our scriptures say, the wicked boasts of his heart's desire, and blesses the covetous whom the Lord abhors. Away then with these deceitful masks, these deluding whitewashes that they may be truthfully seen and scrutinized. Let no man tell me that this and other was a great man because he fought and conquered so and so. In fact, Augustine likens the conflict between Alba and Rome to the pursuit of glory found in gladiatorial contests, yet he finds the former far more appalling. Rome, as a daughter state engaging in war with its mother, would be like a father fighting his son in a gladiatorial arena. Nobody would accept such dreadful spectacle. But it gets even worse because it's not limited to two gladiators, but a battlefield littered with bodies, and display is witnessed not just by contemporaries, but by all future generations, making the entire world an endless audience to this profane spectacle. Central to this whole discussion for Augustine is the matter of divine favour or disfavour demonstrated by the gods that Troy, Alba Longa, and Rome shared. These gods, protectors of Alba Longa, deserted it as they had Troy, precipitating its decline and eventual merger with Rome. Yet the rationale behind Rome's favoured status is perplexing. According to Augustine, the gods' loyalty appears utterly capricious, supporting Rome despite its tumultuous beginnings and ongoing internal conflicts. And so, with that, Augustine will turn to the demise of the early Roman kings. In chapter 15, Augustine explores the lives and demises of the early Roman kings. He begins with Romulus, Rome's first king, who is said to have been assumed into heaven, but he points to the account of other Roman historians which suggest a darker narrative, that he was killed by the Senate due to his cruelty. Nonetheless, a man named Julius Proculus claimed Romulus had appeared to him posthumously in a vision and told him that he had been chosen by the gods to ascend to heaven and was to be worshipped by the Romans as a deity. This claim was apparently bolstered by an eclipse that was interpreted as a divine intervention from Romulus. Augustine questions not only the logic of interpreting this eclipse as divine, but also its interpretation as an approval of Romulus. In fact, the eclipse which occurred is contrasted with the eclipse at the crucifixion of Jesus. He writes, "For an eclipse of the sun had also happened, and this was attributed to the divine power of Romulus by the ignorant multitude, who did not know that it was brought about by the fixed laws of the sun's course, though this grief of the sun might rather have been considered proof that Romulus had been slain, and that the crime was indicated by this deprivation of sun's light, as in truth was the case when the Lord was crucified through the cruelty and impiety of the Jews." In fact, Augustine draws on Cicero's commentary, which suggests that Romulus's deification was more a matter of reputation and veneration for his virtues than a genuine belief in his ascension to godhead. In his book The Republic, Cicero reflects on the circumstances of his sudden disappearance during the eclipse, hinting that such an event would have been used to conceal his death by natural disaster or foul play. The chapter then recounts the violent ends of subsequent Roman kings, excluding Numa and Marcius, who died of natural deaths. Tullus Hostilius was struck by lightning, Priscus Tarquinius was assassinated, Servius Tullius was murdered by his son-in-law, Tarquinius Superbus usurped the throne, and for Augustine these stories all represent and illustrate the tumultuous and often brutal nature of Roman ascension and governance. The irony is that despite these atrocious acts, including parricide, the gods did not abandon the city or its shrines. Tarquin, despite his crime, was successful in wars and built the capital with the spoils under the watchful eyes of the gods. When the last king Tarquin was banished and the Roman Republic established, it was not for his own crimes, but his son's wickedness in raping Lucretia. After his banishment and failed attempt to retake the throne, he lived quietly in Tusculum until his peaceful death. Therefore, the period under the kings, despite its glorification, is for Augustine one of bloodshed and limited expansion, casting a critical light on Rome's foundational myths and the morality of the Romans and their gods. And so with that, Augustine will turn to the disastrous nature of the Roman Republic after the overthrowing of the king. From chapter 16, Augustine discusses the tumultuous period following the expulsion of Tarquin, the tyrant, highlighting the establishment of the Roman consulship as a replacement for the kingship in around 509 BC. According to this system, 2 consuls were elected by the Centuriate Assembly, and they served together for a term of 1 year. This was designed to prevent the accumulation of power in the hands of a single individual and to introduce a system of mutual accountability. The initial consuls were Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, both instrumental in the overthrow of Tarquin. However, the political climate remained unstable, particularly due to the continued threat posed by Tarquin and his allies. Augustine highlights that this first year of Roman consulship was filled with calamity and unnatural deeds. Brutus, for example, in his zeal to protect the fledgling republic, actually executed his own sons and brothers-in-law upon his discovery of their conspiracy to restore Tarquin. Despite this, Brutus's career ended in violence as he perished in battle, killed by the hand of Tarquin's son. Augustine further reflects on the immediate successors of Brutus and Collatinus, noting the swift and grim turnover of consuls within a year, which saw 5 consuls serve. In chapter 17, Augustine continues with the disasters which vexed the Roman Republic after its inauguration in 509, up into the Second Punic War in 201, questioning the efficacy and presence of the Roman gods. Drawing on the Roman historian Sallust, Augustine reflects on the harsh oppression of the common people by the patricians, the aristocracy of the Roman Republic, which is reminiscent of the tyranny of the kings, leading to social strife. As he writes, then began the patricians to oppress the people as slaves, to condemn them as to death or scourging, as the kings had done, to drive them from their holdings, and to tyrannize over those who had no property to lose. The people, overwhelmed by these oppressive measures, and most of all by the usury, and obliged to contribute both money and personal service to the constant wars, at length took arms and ceded to Mount Aventine and Mount Seca, and thus secured for themselves tribunes and protective lords. Augustine here is referring to the first and second succession of the plebs to Aventine Hill in 494 and to the Sacred Mount in 449, which occurred in protest of the patrician class due to the harshness of laws and the abuses. The resolution of this conflict led to some reforms, including the promulgation of the law of the 12 Tables. Drawing on the historian Sallust, Augustine describes this whole period as marked by external wars and internal conflicts, a descent into mobs, seditions, and civil war. He also notes how power was concentrated into the hands of a few elite individuals who, under the guise of serving the public and senate, perpetuated their own authority and valued wealth and power over genuine loyalty to the republic. Therefore, Augustine observes that even Roman historians did not shy away from critiquing their society's shortcomings. In the same spirit, Christians, motivated by commitment to truth and divine hope, are compelled to openly address Rome's spiritual and ethical shortcomings. This imperative is underscored by the tendency to blame Christianity for contemporary misfortunes. A balanced examination of Roman history, though, would have revealed the magnitude of disasters predating Christianity. For Augustine, this approach is driven by a recognition of the impermanent, flawed nature of earthly cities and desire to point people towards the everlasting city of God, the only place where true and lasting citizenship is found. And so with that, Augustine turns to the trials of the Punic Wars. From chapter 18, he continues this honest examination of Roman history, discussing the trials that faced them during the Punic Wars, emphasizing the hardships that were not alleviated by their gods. For some context, the Punic Wars were three major conflicts fought between Rome and Carthage that took place over nearly a century, from 264 to 146 BC. Rome would eventually be victorious and emerge as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, marking the eventual transformation into an empire. The question for Augustine is, at what cost? Throughout these wars, numerous small kingdoms were destroyed, cities razed, and lands devastated as Rome and Carthage vied for supremacy. Besides this, Augustine highlights the faulty religious practice aimed at seeking divine favour, which included the revival of the games. As he writes, on the authority of the Sibylline books, the secular games were reappointed, which had been inaugurated a century before, but had faded into oblivion in happier times. The games consecrated to the infernal gods were also renewed by the pontiffs, for they too had sunk into the disuse in better times. And no wonder, for when they were renewed, the great abundance of dying men made all hell rejoice at its riches, and give itself up to the sport. For certainly the ferocious wars, and disastrous quarrels, and bloody victories, now on one side and now on the other, though most calamities to men, afforded great sport and rich banquet to the devils. Therefore the games were used to mark various anniversaries from the founding of Rome, and they were revived, as Augustine notes, in 249. The purpose of these games was to mark the end of an old and the beginning of a new seculum, that is, age. In terms of the games themselves, they lasted for several days and nights, and featured a mix of religious ceremonies, public sacrifices, public games, theatrical performances, athletic competitions, and musical contests. They were a means of boosting public morale, but more than this, they had deep religious undertones. For all the animal sacrifice and human in the gladiatorial combats was presented to the underworld deities as an offering on behalf of the coming generation to ensure their prosperity and protection. However, these measures were, as Augustine suggests, ineffective and even morbid, given the massive loss of life that provided entertainment for the demonic forces. Besides this, in the First Punic War itself, both the Romans and Carthage experienced huge losses, including that of Marcus Regulus. The Carthaginians defeated Regulus's forces in the Battle of Cape in 256, and he was captured in battle. Augustine comments that his fidelity to the gods and his surpassingly cruel death should make the face of the gods blush. Moreover, Augustine relates further series of natural disasters that struck Rome at that time. This begins with a flood caused by the river Tiber, which devastated the lower parts of the city, damaging buildings. Following this, in around 241, a more destructive fire consumed many buildings around the Forum, including the Temple of Vesta, a place dedicated to preserving an eternal flame by the Vestal Virgins. Metellus, the Pontifex Maximus, that is the high priest, who saved sacred items during this fire, nearly lost his life and was severely injured. Augustine writes, but here you could see how a man could be of greater service to Vesta than she could be to him. Now if these gods could not avert the fire from themselves, what help against flames or flood could they bring to the state of which they were the reputed guardians? Facts have shown that they were useless. Therefore, Augustine questions the efficacy and purpose of worshipping such gods when they cannot protect their own temples or the city they are meant to guard. As such, he criticizes the belief in these gods' ability to ensure earthly well-being and prosperity, suggesting that such faith is misplaced. Augustine extends this criticism to those who believe in the gods for temporal prosperity, highlighting their unwillingness to abandon an indefensible position, despite evidence of the gods' impotence in preventing disaster. And so, in chapter 19, Augustine discusses the severe hardships and devastating effects of the Punic War on both Rome and Carthage, emphasizing how the conflict left the victors, Rome, resembling more the vanquished than the conquerors. He writes, for when Hannibal poured out of Spain over the Pyrenees and overran Gaul, and burst through the Alps, during his whole course gathered strength by plundering and subduing as he went, and inundated Italy like a torrent, how bloody were the wars, and how continuous the engagements that were fought. How often were the Romans vanquished, How many towns went over to the enemy and how many were taken and subdued? In fact, the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC was one of the most infamous military defeats in Roman history. Roman casualties ranged from 50 to 70,000, including many of its military elite. The scale of defeat was symbolized by Hannibal sending 3 bushels of gold rings back to Carthage. These rings were taken from Roman nobles who had fallen in the battle, serving as a grim trophy of victory and a measure of the high rank of those who were killed. Rome had to resort to extreme measures to even survive and eventually win in the Second Punic War. In chapter 20, he delves into the tragic fate of Saguntum, a city allied to Rome that was destroyed by the Carthaginians due to their loyalty to the Roman Republic. The city fell to Hannibal after 8 or 9 months, but in a final act of desperation and to avoid the dishonour of falling into Hannibal's hands, the Saguntines killed their own children and themselves, with many choosing to die by the sword or by throwing themselves into a massive funeral pyre they erected. Augustine questions the power and the benevolence of the Roman gods, citing their inability to save this city, an ally of Rome that was destroyed due to its faithfulness. He writes, "What, then, will the advocates and apologists of these gods say in their defence, when charged with the blood of these Saguntines? For they are professedly worshipped and invoked for this very purpose of securing prosperity in this fleeting and transitory life." Augustine suggests a dilemma. Either the gods are angered by the act of keeping faith, which seems morally perverse, or that individuals and entire communities can suffer and perish despite the god's favour, indicating that the god's worship does not guarantee happiness or protection. This is evidenced by the fates of Regulus and Saguntines, who are faithful to the gods, and that Augustine recommends is the abolition of these religious practices, since they are no guarantee of protection. The military success sowed the seeds of moral and social decay for Augustine, culminating in the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. Following this ultimate defeat, Rome's ensuing peace led to internal corruption, setting a course towards the eventual decline of the Roman Republic itself. This culminates in the era of Caesar Augustus, who, while stabilizing the state, effectively ended the Roman Republic's liberty, steering Rome into a more monarchical system. And so with that, Augustine will discuss next the internal strife, civil wars, and the end of the Roman Republic. So, from chapter 23, Augustine discusses the internal strife that plagued the Roman Republic, such as the civil wars. These civil wars include that of Marius and Sulla from 88 to 87 BC and 83 to 82 BC, or Caesar and Pompey from 49 to 45 BC, or Octavian, who became Augustus, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra from 32 to 30 BC. But there weren't just civil wars where blood was shed, as Augustine writes. What a sea of Roman blood was shed! What desolations and devastations were occasioned in Italy by wars social, wars servile, wars civil. Therefore, besides the civil wars, there were the so-called social wars from 91 to 88 BC, when Roman state and several of its Italian allies, known as the Socii, fought for Roman citizenship, rights, and equality. Besides this, there was the Servile Wars, which involved a series of slave uprisings against the Roman Republic, the most prominent being the Third Servile War from 73 to 71 BC, led by the gladiator Spartacus. This slave uprising involved 70 to 120,000, and it achieved significant successes against Roman forces, coming close to Rome itself, where it was crushed by Crassus and his legion in 71 BC. Again, the point of all this for Augustine is to show the calamities which faced Rome well before Christianity even came on the scene. And so in chapter 24, Augustine discusses the turbulent period of the reform efforts of the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. The proposed Lex Sempronia Agraria in 133 sought to address social and economic inequality through agrarian laws which redistributed land to poorer citizens, which had been monopolized by the nobility. The problem is that these efforts led to significant civil unrest and violence. Tiberius Gracchus is murdered by a group of senators and their supporters in 133, effectively stalling his reform efforts. Gaius Gracchus, taking up his brother's cause, was elected tribune in 123 and re-elected in 122. He pursued a broader set of reforms that included not only land redistribution, but also measures to reduce grain prices, improve soldiers' rights, and extend citizenship rights to Roman allies. Again, however, Gaius' career ended in violence because of the opposition from the elite classes. As Augustine writes, after the death of the younger Gracchus, the consul Lucius Optimus, who had given battle to him within the city and had defeated and put to the sword both himself and his confederates, and had massacred many of the citizens, instituted a judicial examination of others, and is reported to have put to death as many as 3,000 men. These events would have lasting significance for the Roman Republic, as they exposed the deep-seated divisions within Roman society, and many ancient thinkers believed that they led not only to the civil wars, but to the end of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. In chapter 27, Augustine discusses the civil war between Marius and Sulla, spanning from 88 to 82 BC, highlighting the tragic consequences of their power struggles for Rome. The retribution led to widespread death, and the period was marked by lawlessness, where personal vendettas were pursued without restraint. The decisive battle took place near Rome's Colline Gate, where Sulla's forces achieved a significant victory. Following this victory, Sulla entered Rome, marking the end of the war. Augustine writes, the war's toll was immense, not only on the battlefield but also within Rome itself, which was littered with the bodies of the dead. In its streets, squares, markets, theatres and temples, the violence escalated to such an extent that it became difficult to determine whether more people were killed during the conflict or in the aftermath, as the victors sought to consolidate their power through further bloodshed. In chapter 29, Augustine contrasts these atrocities committed during the civil wars, notably by Marius and Sulla, to those devastations suffered during foreign invasions, specifically the Gothic and Gallic invasions. He argues that the internal violence is far more horrific and damaging to the fabric of Roman society. For example, the Gauls who invaded Rome in the 4th century BC killed all senators they encountered outside the capital, but offered those inside the option to buy their lives, showing a form of mercy. Similarly, the Goths who sacked Rome in 410 spared so many senators that their killings seemed surprisingly restrained by comparison. In contrast, Marius and Sulla displayed a far greater level of cruelty, and Augustine highlights that Sulla killed more senators than the Goths had even attempted to plunder. And so in chapter 30, Augustine returns to the absurdity of his contemporaries that claim that calamities befalling Rome were due to the abandonment of the pagan gods in favour of Christianity. Rome had, in fact, been plagued by more severe and frequent disasters, such as the bloody civil wars, long before the advent of Christ. Rome's pattern of internal violence and ambition for power was well established long before Christ came onto the scene, illustrating the deep-seated issues within Roman society which are unrelated to the shift towards Christianity. So, in the final chapter, Augustine concludes by pointing out, as he has thoroughly shown, that even when the traditional gods were fervently worshipped, Rome still experienced significant disasters. And he highlights inconsistency in blaming Christianity for contemporary troubles, while ignoring the fact that similar or even worse calamities occurred during times of widespread pagan worship. He writes, for certainly when these occurred, the altars of the gods were kept blazing, and there arose the mingled fragrance of Sabaean incense and fresh garlands. The priests were clothed with honour, the shrines were maintained in splendour. Sacrifices, games, sacred ecstasies were common in the temples, while the blood of the citizens was being so freely shed, not only in remote places, but among the very altars of the gods. Therefore, these pagan sacrifices did not prevent disasters from occurring, such as the civil wars that led to the shedding of its citizens' blood. sometimes even near the altars of the gods themselves. He points out that notable Romans such as Cicero did not even seek sanctuary in the temples during times of crisis, indicating a lack of faith in the protective power of those gods. In contrast, during the invasion and crises of his time, many sought refuge in Christian churches and were granted safety, highlighting the protective role Christianity played. Augustine argues that if Christianity had been established before various historical calamities, such as the Punic Wars or the invasion of the Gauls, they would have been unfairly attributed to Christianity. In concluding, Augustine criticizes the double standard of his critics, who fail to blame their own gods for significant disasters that happened under their worship, but are quick to blame Christianity for any contemporary troubles. And so, that is it for Book 3 of City of God. Now, Augustine's recollection of Roman history and its disasters can seem quite long-winded. His journey from the foundations of Rome to the Roman Republic, to the Punic Wars, to the Civil Wars, to the end of the Republic itself, are all reminders to the Romans of their own history, which they are apparently ignorant of, given their insistence that the current calamity is a result of the abandonment of pagan deities and the adoption of Christianity. What is clear, as Augustine has shown from many epochs of history, is that there were many calamities from its founding, despite its respect for the gods. Moreover, the example of the pagan gods leads to moral and spiritual decline. Romans therefore ought to turn to Christ for moral and spiritual transformation, rather than blame him for recent disasters, when they can know, if they studied their own histories, that even greater disasters befell Rome when those pagan gods were worshipped. So, okay, thank you for watching. And again, please let me know your thoughts in the comments if you made it all the way to this point in the video. I'd love to hear them. And please also like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Okay, I'll see you next time as we turn to Book 4.